This is Samuel, and this is the story of how they tried to break his soul by planting a knife among his few belongings, a cruel plan to throw him into solitary confinement, a damp, dark hole from which few emerged whole. It was the price he would pay for his faith, the punishment for carrying a light in a place that only knew darkness. Has your faith ever been tested in a place where hope dares not enter? Before I tell you how God acted in his life, when humiliation seemed certain and abandonment was the only certainty, at comment here, where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when we place everything in his hands, even when the whole world turns its back. The Pedra Alta State Penitentiary was no place for men of faith. It was a kingdom of concrete and despair, governed by an unwritten law, the law of Falcão. He was the leader of the dominant faction, a man whose authority was cemented in fear and violence. For Falcão, Samuel's calmness was a provocation. While other inmates screamed, fought, and killed each other for respect, Samuel knelt on the cold cell floor every morning. He didn't preach, he didn't shout verses. His faith was a silent act, a quiet strength that began to bother the king of that hell. Falcão saw Samuel's peace not as holiness, but as a direct affront to his power, a kind of rebellion he could not tolerate. Samuel felt the weight of stares on him every day in the yard. It was a mixture of curiosity, contempt, and in a few, silent admiration. He knew his posture made him a target. In that place, kindness was interpreted as weakness, and serenity as an invitation to aggression. He remembered his pastor saying, years before everything fell apart, that the strongest faith is not the one that publicly moves mountains, but the one that keeps us firm when the avalanche of injustice tries to bury us. Inside Pedra Alta, every day was an avalanche, and he remained standing, not out of stubbornness, but out of an internal conviction that he was not alone, even when surrounded by the deepest human loneliness. Sergeant Rocha was part of the brutal landscape of Pedra Alta, a middle-aged man, his face marked by the cynicism of someone who had seen the worst of humanity for decades. To him, everyone there was the same guilty trash. He watched Samuel with particular contempt. He saw that calmness, that refusal to retaliate against provocations, and saw only a well-elaborated farce, a mask for some kind of weakness or cunning that he had not yet discovered. Everyone here has a price or a trick, he used to grumble to the other guards, as his eyes scanned the yard and settled on Samuel, who was sharing his bread with an older, sick inmate. Rocha didn't see compassion. He saw a move in a game he didn't understand. Meanwhile, from a corner of the yard, young, frightened eyes followed Samuel's every move. They were the eyes of Leo, a young man who had arrived a few weeks ago, swallowed. By the brutality of that system, he saw the violence of Falcão's faction and the fear it imposed. But he also saw Samuel. He saw the man who did not bow, who did not shout, who seemed to have an invisible shield against all the hatred that circulated in the air. Samuel's peace was a mystery to Leo, an anomaly in that environment. He didn't understand how someone could be so serene in the midst of chaos. It was like finding a spring of clean water in the middle of a swamp, and he felt a desperate thirst to get closer to that spring. Samuel's influence, however silent, began to create ripples. Other inmates, especially the younger and more vulnerable ones like Leo, began to move away from Falcão's shadows, preferring to sit in silence near where Samuel said his prayers or read his battered Bible. It wasn't a mutiny, it wasn't a rebellion. It was something much more subtle and, for Falcão, much more dangerous. It was a shift in spiritual power. He was losing his monopoly on fear to a man who offered nothing but peace. Samuel's tranquility was becoming more attractive than Falcão's promise of violent protection, and this was a threat that needed to be crushed publicly. Falcão was not a man for direct confrontations when he could use cunning. Humiliation was his preferred weapon. He decided to break Samuel in a way that would destroy his reputation and isolate him completely. The plan was simple and cruel. During the night, while most of the inmates slept the restless sleep of the condemned, one of his men, acting under his express orders, slipped stealthily to Samuel's cell. The place was almost monastic, with few belongings, a thin blanket, a metal mug, and his Bible. With a swift movement, Falcão's man hid a handmade knife, sharp and lethal, between the pages of the holy book. The trap was set. The next morning, the air in the yard was different. There was an electric tension, an expectation that hung over everyone. Falcone's men looked at Samuel with scornful smiles, while the other inmates sensed that something was about to happen. Samuel, in his routine, felt the change in the atmosphere, but continued his morning ritual. He prayed on his knees, asking God for strength not to fight, but to endure. He didn't know what the day had in store for him, but his spirit was on alert. He could smell the scent of trial in the air, a familiar odor in that place, but this time it seemed to be coming directly towards him, carried on a wind of deliberate evil. The moment to reap the evil plan arrived, with the call for a routine inspection, which on that day conveniently would be more rigorous. Sergeant Rocha walked down the corridor with an uncharacteristic urgency, his steps echoing like a sentence. Falcone, strategically positioned in the yard, exchanged a quick glance with the sergeant, an almost imperceptible nod. The anonymous tip had already been made. The information that the deacon was armed had already reached the right ears. The gears of injustice began to turn, and Samuel was at its center, about to be ground by it in front of everyone who watched him. The arena was ready for the spectacle of his fall. Falcone watched everything from a distance, with the certainty of victory. He wanted to see the despair in Samuel's eyes. He wanted everyone to see the saint being dragged to solitary confinement like a common criminal. The humiliation would be total. He would destroy not only the man, but the symbol he represented. He wanted to prove to everyone, especially to young men like Leo, that in that place there was no room for God, that faith was an illusion, and that, in the end, the only real force was his. The knife in the Bible was more than a trap. It was a declaration of war against hope, an act to extinguish the last spark of light in Pedra Alta. Sergeant Rocha stopped in front of Samuel, and the silence in the yard became heavy, almost palpable. He didn't say a word at first. He just looked at Samuel with that air of superiority, the look of someone who already has the verdict ready even before presenting the accusation. The other guards formed a semicircle, blocking any escape route, as if Samuel, the man who never raised his voice, was an imminent threat. Samuel, for his part, just finished his silent prayer and stood up slowly. He showed no fear. There was a deep sadness on his face, not for himself, but for the evil he felt approaching, a darkness orchestrated to extinguish his small light. He could feel Falcone's gaze burning on his back, savoring every second of that scene. "Inspection in Cell 7. Rocha's voice sounded harsh, breaking the silence. He pushed Samuel aside without ceremony and entered the cramped space. His movements were rough, disrespectful. He threw the blanket on the floor, kicked the thin mattress over, and banged on the concrete wall as if looking for a false bottom. Samuel watched from the outside, his heart heavy. It wasn't the fear of solitary that afflicted him at that moment, but the pain of slander. He remembered his father teaching him that the worst prison is not the one with bars, but the one that men build for you with lies. And there he was, about to be imprisoned by a truth that was not his, a trap set with the precision of hatred. The search was a performance. Rocha ignored the corners, the crevices. He went straight to the small wooden crate where Samuel kept his mug and the Bible. He picked up the book with a feigned care, almost a mockery. "Let's see what the saint has been reading," he said, loud enough for everyone in the yard to hear. He flipped through the pages with his thumb, and then, with a calculated gesture, let the Bible fall open. The handmade knife slid from within the book and hit the cement floor with a metallic, dry, and definitive sound. The improvised blade, sharp and dirty, gleaming under the dim light, looked like a profanation next to the holy book. A collective murmur went through the crowd of inmates. The air grew even denser. Falcone smiled, a wide, victorious smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. It was the image he wanted to engrave in everyone's mind. The man of faith, exposed as a fraud, an armed hypocrite. On the faces of the other inmates, there was a mixture of reactions. Some looked with renewed contempt, pleased to see the different one fall. Others, with a hint of disappointment, as if a small hope had been extinguished. And Leo, the scared young man, felt his stomach turn. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, but the proof was there on the floor. His heart sank, not with anger at Samuel, but with an immense pain, the pain of seeing the only good thing in that place being stained so dirtily. Sergeant Rocha bent down, picked up the knife by the tip of the improvised handle, and held it up to Samuel's eye level. The guard's face was a mask of triumph and contempt. "What is this, deacon?" The word deacon came out of his mouth laden with venom and sarcasm. "Using God's book to hide a weapon. I thought your strength came from somewhere else." The humiliation was public, as sharp as the blade he held. All eyes were fixed on Samuel, waiting for his reaction. They expected him to deny, to scream, to despair, to accuse Falcão. They expected the explosion that would confirm his guilt, for in that place innocence rarely presented itself in silence. But Samuel did not explode. For an instant, the world around him seemed to disappear. The noise of the yard, the mocking faces, the threatening figure of Rocha all faded away. In his mind a single image appeared, him, on his knees on the church floor, years ago, listening to the pastor preach about Daniel in the lion's den. Faith did not save him from entering the den, the pastor said, but it protected him inside it. At that moment Samuel understood. His trial was not a sign of God's abandonment, but a test of where his trust truly lay. It was not about being saved from the furnace, but about walking inside it with the certainty that he was not alone. A peace that defied the logic of the situation began to flood his heart. Then, he did something no one expected. He simply closed his eyes for a second. He breathed in and out slowly, as if connecting to a force that no one there could see. The entire yard held its breath. That small gesture of calm in the eye of the storm was more disconcerting than any cry of denial. The silence became absolute. Even Sergeant Rocha, with the knife still raised, seemed to hesitate, caught off guard by the absence of panic in the man before him. Samuel's refusal to participate in the spectacle of hatred and fear momentarily disarmed his tormentors. They had the script ready, but the main actor refused to follow his lines. When he opened his eyes, they contained no fear or anger. There was a serene firmness in them, a spiritual authority that seemed out of place in that environment. He looked directly at Sergeant Rocha, and with a calm voice but clear enough for all to hear, said, "My life is in God's hands, Sergeant. The truth always finds the light, even in the darkest places." The words were not a plea, they were a declaration, a statement of unshakable faith that hung in the air, challenging the cynicism and violence of Pedra Alta. Rocha frowned, visibly annoyed. That was not the reaction he expected. There was no way to mock that dignity. Next, Samuel slowly turned his head, and his gaze met Falcão's, on the other side of the yard. Everyone expected an accusation, a pointed finger, but what they saw was even more shocking. Samuel did not look at Falcão with hatred, but with a deep, almost sad compassion. It was the look of someone who sees the poverty of spirit behind the mask of power. That look disarmed Falcão completely. The victorious smile faltered on his face, replaced by an expression of pure confusion. The victory, which seemed so sweet seconds before, now had a bitter and empty taste. He wanted to break Samuel, but the man in front of him seemed more whole than ever. Finally, Samuel turned back to Sergeant Rocha. Without another word, he extended his hands forward, wrists together, ready to be handcuffed. He accepted the unjust consequence, not as a defeated man, but as someone who trusted in a higher court. His submission was not an act of weakness, but the greatest display of strength that yard had ever witnessed. He was surrendering the battle into God's hands, in front of everyone. The tension was unbearable. His refusal to play the game of violence left everyone, including his tormentors, unsure of how to react to the man who refused to be broken. Sergeant Rocha was paralyzed for a moment, handcuffs in hand. Samuel's peaceful surrender destabilized him more than any physical resistance would have. He was used to dealing with anger, denial, despair. He knew how to crush arrogance and silence screams. But how do you deal with a man who offers his wrists with the serenity of a martyr? There was something in Samuel's attitude that prevented him from simply slapping on the cuffs and dragging him to solitary. For the first time in years, Rocha felt a pang of doubt, an uncomfortable hesitation. The script was perfect. The proof was there. But the condemned man's reaction was all wrong, and that made him deeply uncomfortable. He looked at Falcão, perhaps hoping for a sign, a gesture that would encourage him to proceed. But Falcão also seemed shaken. The compassion in Samuel's eyes had hit him like a punch to the gut. He, the king of Pedra Alta, the man everyone feared, felt small, exposed. The victory he had planned so carefully was unraveling, turning into something he couldn't control. The silence in the yard was no longer one of expectation, but of judgment, and suddenly he felt that the judge was not the sergeant, but the very man he had tried to destroy. The atmosphere was charged, and the balance of power, which had previously tilted entirely in his favor, began to tremble. It was in that moment of hesitation, as Samuel's fate hung in the balance, that a trembling voice cut through the silence. It wasn't him. The words came out low, almost a whisper, but they echoed in the yard like thunder. All eyes turned to the source of the voice. Leo. The young inmate was on his feet, trembling from head to toe, his face pale with dread. He stared at the floor, unable to face Falcão, but his hand pointed timidly in the direction of Samuel's cell. The fear was visible in every inch of his body, but something inside him, a spark of courage ignited by Samuel's dignity, forced him to speak. He knew he was signing his own death warrant. "What did you say, kid?" Rocha snarled, turning to Leo with fury. The interruption was a breach of protocol, an affront to his authority. The attention shifted from Samuel to the frightened young man. Falcão's men began to move, their glares promising swift and brutal retaliation. Leo swallowed hard, the words stuck in his throat. He could feel the danger closing in around him, but then he raised his eyes for a second and saw Samuel's face. There was no surprise, no relief. There was only a silent gratitude, an encouragement that gave him the strength to continue. "I saw," he stammered, his voice a little firmer. I saw Falcão order him to plant the knife there. It was Rato, his man." The direct accusation sent a shockwave through the yard. To openly accuse Falcão was suicide. The man, named Rato, one of Falcão's most loyal henchmen, stepped forward, his face contorted with anger. "He's lying, Sergeant. The new kid's crazy." The word of a scared newcomer against that of an established member of the faction was worthless. Rocha was already prepared to dismiss the testimony and punish Leo for his insolence. The situation seemed about to explode into violence. Rocha raised his hand to silence everyone, ready to give the final order to take Samuel and probably Leo with him. The scales seemed to be tipping back towards injustice, and the small flame of hope was about to be extinguished, but God works in ways that no man can predict. At the exact moment Rocha opened his mouth to seal their fate, an iron gate on the other side of the yard creaked open loudly. Everyone turned. To the surprise and general shock, the person who entered was the prison warden, a man who rarely came down to the yards, known for his strictness and for running the penitentiary from his air-conditioned office. He was accompanied by a captain of the guard, making a surprise inspection, something that hadn't happened in years. The sudden presence of the prison's highest authority froze everyone in place. The power dynamic changed instantly. The warden stopped, observing the unusual scene. Rocha with a knife in his hand, Samuel with his wrists extended, Leo trembling in the middle of the yard, and Falcão's faction in a state of contained agitation. "What is happening here?" "Sergeant?" The warden's voice was calm but carried an unquestionable authority. Rocha, who was previously the master of the situation, suddenly found himself in the position of having to give explanations. He straightened his posture, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. The situation, which was a simple case of internal discipline, now had the boss's attention. He knew that any mistake, any procedure ignored, could cost him his job. Sergeant Rocha, a pragmatic and jaded man, felt an internal shift. Samuel's inexplicable attitude, Leo's desperate courage, and now the warden's presence, everything conspired for him, for the first time in a long time, to do things by the book. Samuel's strange dignity had planted a seed of doubt in his cynical mind, and the unexpected witness, however fragile, gave him a justification not to take the easy way out. Looking at the warden, he decided to play it safe. "We found this weapon in inmate Samuel's belongings," he said, pointing. "But this other inmate," he indicated Leo, "alleges it was planted on Falcão's orders." The mention of Falcão's name made the warden frown. He knew the faction leader's reputation and the instability he caused. The situation was no longer about a simple knife. It was about control of the prison. The commotion had caught his attention, and he walked slowly towards the group, his eyes assessing each face. He looked at Falcão, who was trying to maintain a facade of indifference, then at Leo, who was trembling, and finally at Samuel, who remained in a deep and serene silence. Samuel's calmness in the midst of the confusion was what stood out the most. It was a piece that didn't fit in the puzzle of violence and fear. Nervous tension hit Falcone's group. The unexpected presence of the warden and the captain destabilized everyone. Rato, the man who planted the knife, began to sweat cold. In an impulsive move, trying to get rid of something he was carrying in his pocket, he moved abruptly. The movement was small, but in the tense quiet of that moment, it was enough to catch the attention of the guard captain accompanying the warden. The captain, trained to notice any anomaly, focused his gaze on Rato. It was then that the henchman's nervous hand failed. A small package, wrapped in plastic, fell from his pocket and slid across the cement floor, stopping near Sergeant Roach's boot. The small package on the floor seemed to scream in the ensuing silence. No one needed to be an expert to know what it was. The drugs, now exposed at the feet of authority, changed everything. Sergeant Rocha looked at the package, then at Rato's pale face, and then at Falcone, whose control finally broke, revealing an impotent fury. The lie about the knife began to crumble under the weight of a stupid mistake. The guard captain did not hesitate. "Search him," he ordered, pointing at Rato. Two guards grabbed the henchman, who didn't even try to resist. Fear paralyzed him completely. The attempt to destroy Samuel was beginning to backfire spectacularly. The search of Rato was quick and efficient. In addition to another package of drugs, they found a cell phone with him, a strictly prohibited item. The situation escalated from a simple possession of a handmade weapon to drug trafficking and illegal communication within the penitentiary. The warden looked at Falcone with an ice-cold stare. "And you?" he said. "Your man seems nervous. We're going to search you and the rest of your group as well." The order was like a sentence. Fear spread among Falcone's men like wildfire. The aura of untouchability they had cultivated had shattered in a matter of minutes. Their power, built on intimidation and veiled violence, meant nothing before the formal authority of the prison, now exercised in its fullness. As Falcone's men were lined up and searched one by one, the truth about the knife became undeniable. Under pressure from the warden and the captain, and with the discovery of the drugs, Rato confessed everything. Stammering, he admitted that he acted under Falcone's direct orders, that the plan was to discredit Samuel, break his influence, and send him to solitary as an example for anyone who dared not to bow. The confession was heard by everyone in the yard. Every word was a nail in the coffin of Falcone's authority. The mask of the ruthless leader fell, revealing a petty man, afraid of losing his power to the silent strength of faith. Samuel watched everything without changing. His serene expression. He felt no joy at his enemy's fall, nor relief at his own vindication. What he felt was a deep and overwhelming confirmation of God's presence. It was not an intervention with lightning and thunder, but a sequence of perfectly orchestrated events, the courage of a young man, the unexpected arrival of the warden, the nervous mistake of a guilty party. It was the hand of God acting in human imperfection, using fear, bureaucracy, and coincidence to bring about justice. He bowed his head not to hide, but in a gesture of silent gratitude. His morning prayer asking for strength to endure had been answered in a way he could never have imagined. Falcone's reputation imploded. The basis of his power was fear, the belief that he was smarter and crueler than anyone else. Seeing him exposed, humiliated, and powerless before the warden shattered that illusion forever. His men, now also implicated in drug and contraband possession, looked at him no longer with loyalty, but with resentment. He was not a leader protecting his pack. He was a king whose house of cards had collapsed, dragging everyone down with him. He was handcuffed and taken away, not to solitary, but to a maximum security wing, from where his influence would never reach the yard again. Falcone's reign of terror in Pedra Alta was over. The warden then turned to Samuel. He observed him for a long moment, an indecipherable expression on his face. He had heard of the saint, but had always dismissed it as prison folklore. Now seeing the man before him, who faced a false accusation and public humiliation with supernatural calm, he understood that there was something more there. He looked at the Bible on the floor, next to where the knife had been. In a gesture that shocked everyone, he bent down himself, picked up the book, wiped off the dust, and handed it back to Samuel. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, his voice devoid of its former harsh tone. It was an act of respect, a public acknowledgement of Samuel's innocence. With the situation resolved, the warden also addressed Leo. The young man was still trembling, but now there was a glint of relief in his eyes. "You showed courage, son," the warden said. "For your safety, we're transferring you to a more secure block." Leo nodded, his heart full of gratitude. Before being led away, he looked at Samuel and, for the first time, smiled. It was a small, timid smile, but it carried the weight of a life saved and a newfound faith. That day, Leo learned that true strength was not in knives and factions, but in the courage to stand up for the truth, no matter how terrifying. Sergeant Rocha watched the scene, feeling like a complete fool. His lifelong cynicism had been challenged and defeated in less than an hour. He, who saw everyone as guilty, had been a pawn in a criminal's game and had almost committed a terrible injustice. He looked at Samuel, who was now holding his Bible to his chest, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: respect. A fearful, almost reverent respect. He didn't understand Samuel's faith. He didn't comprehend his calmness, but he could no longer deny its strength. From that day on, the way Sergeant Rocha looked at the men under his guard began to slowly change. The news of what happened in the yard spread through the penitentiary like wildfire. Samuel's figure was transformed. He was no longer the weak saint, the easy target. He became a silent legend. The inmates did not fear him as they feared Falcone, but they respected him in a much deeper way. He was living proof that there was another form of power, a force that didn't need weapons or screams. His cell, once a place of solitary prayer, became a refuge for others. Men came not to ask for favors or protection, but just to sit near him, to feel a bit of that inexplicable peace that emanated from him. Samuel's honor was restored, not by a lawyer or a judge in the outside world, but by the manifestation of his faith in action, right there in the hell of Pedra Alta. Divine justice did not come in the form of a spectacular miracle, but through courage, truth, and the natural consequences of evil. God did not prevent the trap from being set, but he was present at every step to disarm it. The trial not only tested Samuel's faith, but strengthened it and made it a beacon for other men lost in the darkness. Years later, when Samuel finally managed to prove his innocence of the crime that sent him to Pedra Alta and left as a free man, the story of the day the knife was planted was still told by the inmates and even by some of the older guards. It became a testimony, a reminder that even in the darkest place on earth, light can prevail. The fall of Falcone and the silent rise of Samuel's reputation served as a permanent lesson on the nature of true strength. Samuel's calm in the face of injustice, Leo's courage, the providential arrival of the warden, it all came together in a way that no one could have planned. It was God's answer, not to cries of despair, but to the silent surrender of a faithful heart. That day left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. The bill for arrogance and evil was paid, not with violence, but with the truth, in a way that only God knows how to do, exposing the darkness simply by turning on a light. Sergeant Rocha, who was nearing retirement, used to tell the story to the younger guards, not as a prison tale, but as a warning. Never underestimate. A man who has nothing to lose but his faith, he would say, in a tone that was no longer cynical but thoughtful. I saw it with my own eyes. They said God didn't enter Pedra Alta until they saw what that black man's faith did in that yard. That day, in the Pedra Alta penitentiary, everyone learned a lesson. Some walls are built to contain men, but no wall is high enough to imprison the faith of one who walks with God. Samuel's victory was not about proving his innocence to men, but about living his trust in God so fully that the truth itself felt compelled to come to his defense. If you know someone who needs their faith strengthened, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about how faith in God can move mountains, even in the most unlikely places. Thank you for listening.